All righty, here we are for our study in First Kings. We can't be in person to do this, but we're going to go ahead and do the lesson. You can pick up a study sheet Sunday at worship and then follow along on the YouTube video and study through First Kings. Here is our review from 2 Samuel. And so we'll go through the quiz questions. And while I go through these, you can just shout out the answer. I might not hear you, probably won't, but you can still shout out the answer if you know it. From 2 Samuel, our key memory verse was 2 Samuel 24:24. The king said to Araunah, "No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing." Indeed, our sacrifice and our praise to the Lord is to cost us something. There is to be a sacrifice involved as we worship the Lord. All right, true or false questions here. Samuel, Nathan, and Gad are given credit for input into writing the book of 2 Samuel. True or false? True. Number 2, 2 Samuel is also known as the book of David's house. False. It's the book of David's reign. Number 3, David reigned 7.5 years in Jerusalem and 32.5 years in Hebron. Again, that's false. He ruled 32.5 years in Jerusalem, not Hebron. Number 4, David showed unusual kindness for caring for Saul's crippled son. You'll remember his name was Mephibosheth. But the answer is false. He wasn't Saul's son. He was Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson. Next, Araunah's threshing floor was also known as Mount Sinai. False. It was known as Mount Horeb, not Sinai. Number 6, Jerusalem was previously called Jebus. True. Number 7, David was also known as the sweet psalmist of Israel. True, again. And number 8, David's rebellion in counting the army cost 70,000 men their lives. Yes, that's true. And so you're getting a review of 2 Samuel, and I hope that review helps you to retain some of what we have studied and what we've learned. We come now to 1 Kings, and we want to look at 1 Kings and skim through it real quickly to see what the Lord would teach us from this wonderful book. The author is unknown. However, tradition credits Jeremiah as the writer of 1 Kings. The date, there's some historical data that has revealed to us the reigns of David and Solomon somewhere in the mid-10th century BC to the mid-6th century. So this was possibly composed during the 8th and 6th centuries BC. The key verse we're going to choose is 1 Kings 3 and verse 9. 1 Kings 3 verse 9. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? This is Solomon as he begins his reign, praying to the Lord for wisdom. Now, 1st and 2nd Kings are the second set of double books. You remember we mentioned when we started with 1 Samuel that 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles were originally one book for those two sets. And while they tell the continuing story, we're still going to separate 1st Kings from 2nd Kings. The main theme of 1st Kings is division because of disobedience. division because of disobedience. It is epitomized in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 11, where God gives a decree to Solomon. Solomon, at one point, or at this point, has forsaken the Lord and turned away from him. And God says, because you have done this and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. So this is God's decree to Solomon. You're no longer going to reign. I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you. In fact, the kingdom will be divided. And so this is God's decree for Solomon's disobedience. The book can be broken into 4 distinct sections, and we're going to look at them in 4 distinct ways. The end of David's reign, the 40-year reign of Solomon, the first 80 years of the divided kingdom, and then the ministry of Elijah as he comes on the scene as the prophet of God. Well, let's look first at the end of David's reign. This is chapters 1 and 2, the end of David's reign. And I think the book opens with one of the saddest commentaries on the life of David. In the opening verse, the aged king is alone and cold. He is literally on his deathbed. There are no children. There are none of his family who have gathered around him to comfort him and console him as his life ebbed away. Instead, they had to seek a young virgin to lie with him just to keep him warm. Now, that's a sad commentary on King David, but that was the end of his life. And so during this vulnerable time, there were some things that happened. The first thing we read in chapter 1 and verses 5 to 8 is that Adonijah attempts to usurp the throne with the help of Joab and Abiathar. Now, Joab was, according to Scripture, he had been David's right-hand man. He was the leader of the army of David. He was assigned by David to lead the army. And we read in 1 Kings 1 and verse 6 that Adonijah, his son, David's son, had never been rebuked by his father. And as a handsome man, he persuaded Joab and Abiathar to side with him after the death of his father. So this is a coup taking place by Adonijah with the help of 2 men who had been faithful to David. The second thing we find is that Solomon is crowned king. Solomon, of course, is the son of Bathsheba, who spoke with the king as Nathan had prompted her to do. David had not heard of the coup taking place by Adonijah. And so Nathan the prophet conferred with Bathsheba and encouraged her to go to King David and say, well, you know, Adonijah is trying to take over the kingdom, and you said that Solomon, my son, would be king after you. And so she did. She ratted out Adonijah, and David heard of this coup. And when Adonijah heard the celebration of Solomon's coronation, then he ran to the altar and he grabbed a hold of the horns of the altar. That was a sign by which he was seeking the protection of God. And when word came to Solomon about Adonijah, he called for him to come and see him. And we read this interesting interchange in chapter 1 and verses 52 and 53. Adonijah has run, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar. And so Solomon calls him in and he says, if he is a worthy man, not one of his hairs will fall to the ground, but if wickedness is found in him, he will die. And so King Solomon sent and he brought them down to the altar, from the altar, and he came and prostrated himself before King Solomon. And Solomon said, go to your house. So Adonijah humbled himself before the king, the true king. And Solomon said, well, just go home. It was a sign of respect. It was a sign of compassion on the part of Solomon to this man who had tried to take the throne. The third thing, as we see at the end of David's reign, is David's death. After a 40-year reign, he is buried in the city of David. This is, of course, the city of Jerusalem, known as the city of David. And thus ends the reign of David. The next section is the 40-year reign of Solomon. That begins in chapter 2 and runs through chapter 11. And we want to kind of see some of the highlights of Solomon's reign. And there are 8 things that really stick out about Solomon's reign. The first is Solomon's wisdom. According to chapter 3 and verses 7 and 9, he sought an understanding heart. This is our key verse that we mentioned. He says, I can't judge these people. I can't judge them at all. And so give me an understanding heart. Of course, in chapter 3, we also see his wisdom as the 2 women, one of whom's baby died, and they both claimed that the baby was there. Solomon called for a sword to cut the baby in 2, but the real mother said, no, don't kill him. Go ahead and let her have him. And so Solomon showed his wisdom, and he gained great wisdom because it was a gift of God. The second thing we see about Solomon is his wealth. His wealth. There were tributes from all other nations who came into Solomon rather, all of his days. The Queen of Sheba sought firsthand information on the wealth of Solomon in chapter 10. And she said, the half has not been told to me about his wealth. It's beyond imagination and beyond understanding. Listen to verse 14 of 1 Kings chapter 10. Because Solomon is receiving all of these tributes, there nations and kings would provide these tributes. And it says, the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides everything that came from the traders and the wares, the merchants, and all the kings and the Arabs and the governors of the country. So on top of all that, he had 666 talents of gold. If you do a little bit of calculation, that comes to about 25 tons of gold, or about $4 billion in our money, every year was brought to King Solomon. This was his wealth. The third thing we see about Solomon's reign is his temple. His temple, we see in chapter 6 that it took him 7 years to build the temple. And this was to worship God. This was to honor God. David had originally intended to build the temple, but God said, no, you're a man of war. You're a man of blood. And so it'll be your son who builds it. So this was the temple. It took him 7 years. And then we see that Solomon built his own house. He built a house unlike any other house. No one could compare to this. And it took him 13 years to build his house. And so it was quite an extravagant building. In chapter 5, number 5 rather, we read of Solomon's feast in chapter 8. When he built the house of God, when he built the temple of God, they had a feast of celebration for 14 days in which they offered up sacrifices, they offered up praise, they offered up worship. 14 days in dedicating the temple. Number 6, we see Solomon's vision. In chapter 9, we read about his vision for what the Lord would have him do. And he has this vision where God comes to him and says, I will give you a perpetual kingdom. Chapter 9 and verse 4, he says, if you keep my ordinances and my statutes, I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David. So this is the vision that he has, that his kingdom is going to last. Number 7, we find Solomon's fault in chapter 11. In verses 1 to 13, we read how he abandoned the Lord of Israel. He forsook God. He describes it describes for us how he took foreign women as his wives and as concubines. He had all of these women whose foreign gods were brought with them, and their worship was brought with them. And in this, he forsook God. If chapter 10 describes the high point of Solomon's reign, then chapter 11 describes the low point. Chapter 10 is his high success. Chapter 11 would be his greatest failure. And then as we go on in chapter 11, we also read of Solomon's death. He is buried and he is succeeded by his son, Rehoboam. That's chapter 11 and verse 43. Succeeded by his son, Rehoboam. Well, that's the middle part. That's the 40-year reign of Solomon. We see how he worked. But then we come to the first 80 years of the divided kingdom. You'll remember Rehoboam became Solomon's successor, but there was Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who led a rebellion and took 10 tribes with him. Jeroboam ruled in the north, and he reigned over Israel. Israel were the 10 tribes gathered together under the banner of Jeroboam. The territory was far larger, it was far richer. They retained most of their foreign alliances, and so the northern kingdom was pretty wicked because they had forsaken the Lord. In the south, you had Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. He's ruling in the south, and he reigned over Judah. So you had Israel in the north, you had Judah in the south, Rehoboam in the north, or Jeroboam in the north, and Rehoboam in the south. And it's a sad commentary on Rehoboam in 2 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 14. And you can hear that, 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 14. It says, Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years. His mother's name was Naamah of the Ammonites. And he did evil because he did not set his heart on the Lord. His evil was not focusing on the Lord. Rather, he focused on everything else around him. Now, 2 of the 4 kings in the south, 2 of the 4 kings that we read about here in 1 Kings, Asa and Jehoshaphat, were good kings. They were good men, and they reigned for a total of 66 years in the south. So the northern kingdom with Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Israel, they were an apostate nation. They had forsaken the Lord. While Rehoboam in the south leads Judah, who for the most part remain faithful, but eventually they fall as well. The last part, the last section of the book is the ministry of Elijah. That covers chapters 17 to 22. Now it begins when the kingdom is divided. And the name Elijah means Yahweh is God. Yahweh is God. Now, in a way, you could say we've been mispronouncing this prophet's name all these years. It would be Elijah. Elijah. Well, you see, the Jews didn't really hit the J so much, so Elijah. So we'll call him Elijah because everybody's familiar with him that way. But we first meet him in chapter 17 when he announces, there will be neither dew nor rain these 3 years except by my word. This was his prophetic vision from the Lord. And certainly it was that way. While he stayed with a woman in Zarephath, a widow woman in Zarephath, he raised her son back to life. This is the ministry of Elijah. Now, there were some highlights of Elijah's life, and we're familiar with a few of them probably. The first highlight we're going to focus on is he boldly confronted wicked King Ahab. This is in chapters 18 and in chapter 18, verses 18 and 19. Ahab had no fear of the Lord. He had no reason to respect the Lord, no worship of the Lord. He was a wicked king. But his servant Obadiah did. And Obadiah, unbeknownst to Ahab, took 100 prophets of God and hid them in the caves. And he fed them. And then he returned to King Ahab, and then they both met up with Elijah. And Elijah was called by Ahab, "You troubler of Israel." You see, when the prophet of God spoke the truth, Ahab didn't like it. And so he thought Elijah was causing all kinds of trouble for Israel. But it was Ahab who was troubling Israel by following the Baals and worshiping the Baals. And that led to the showdown between Elijah and Baal's prophets. We read about that, of course, in chapter 18. It is there that Elijah confronted the 450 prophets of Baal and triumphed over them. As you read that account, Elijah mocked them on several occasions. But at the end of it all, he said, Yahweh is God. There is no other God. Yahweh is God, truly God. But even after that triumph, Elijah ran in the strength of the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. But he finally reached Horeb. And there God confronted him for running away, because he's running away from Jezebel. And he's running away, and he is reminded that God had reserved for himself still 7,000 prophets in Israel, and Elijah was not alone. I think there are times in ministry, there are times in service to the Lord, we think we're the only ones that are being faithful. Elijah certainly did, but he wasn't. God said, look, there are more that you don't know about. And so he encouraged Elijah to be faithful. So he boldly confronted wicked King Ahab. He triumphed over the 450 prophets of Baal. Thirdly, he passed his mantle on to Elisha. Elisha was one who kind of followed after Elijah. Elisha means, my God is salvation. Now, what does it mean that he gave him his mantle? Well, a mantle was an outer cloak. And to pass it along to another man meant that he was a trusted friend. He was someone reliable. But it might also mean that Elisha was now going to be clothed in the spirit of Elijah and carry on the work of Yahweh. So just as Moses passed along some of his honor to Joshua back in Numbers 27, so Elijah did with Elisha. Now, these two prophets spoke in the name of the Lord, and they were bold witnesses for the Lord. And we'll see more about Elisha as we continue on in 2 Kings. Now, for a brief lesson, we've got just a little bit of time, so let's do a brief lesson. Turn to chapter 10. We go back to the highlight of Solomon's reign as all of these kings and nations are bringing tribute. The Queen of Sheba comes to see the wealth of Solomon. But we read this in 1 Kings chapter 10, in verses 16 and 17. Now, King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each large shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest in Lebanon. Now, this is an interesting picture to see these gold shields that Solomon would use. And we're going to find out in a little while as we continue our study, but he would use them to line the pathway as he would go to worship in the house of the Lord. Now, Solomon's wealth with these shields, all in all, that would be about $225 million he used to make these shields. That was the total value of the shields. And he's just simply showing off his great wealth. Another sign of his wealth was he built a great throne out of ivory and then overlaid it in gold. And beside the arms of the throne, he had the figures of a lion, one on each side. It had 6 steps that went up to the throne. And on the side of each step, there was a lion, 12 lions in all. So he's just simply showing off his wealth. He's showing off his majesty. He's showing off his reign. Now, about these shields, he made these shields. Now, skip over to chapter 14. Solomon has died. Rehoboam is now reigning. But this is what we read. It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, 5 years later, that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything, even taking the shields of gold which Solomon had made. Shishak robs Israel, Judah, of all Solomon's wealth. And so King Rehoboam, catch this, made shields of bronze in their place and committed them to the care of the commanders of the guard who guarded the doorway of the king's house. And it happened as often as the king entered the house of the Lord that the guards would carry them and would bring them back into the guard's room. Now, this is the deal. Rehoboam evidently has been using those same shields that Solomon made as he would go to worship the Lord. And you can only imagine the splendor and the brilliance that led the path to the house of the Lord as the king would go to worship. Just the brilliance of the sun shining off those shields would be unimaginable. But there was not a happy ending. Shishak comes and he takes the shields. He steals them. But we have to skip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 12 to see the end of the story. 2 Chronicles chapter 12, pick it up in verse 9. Shishak came up from Egypt against Jerusalem and took all the treasures of the house of the Lord, treasure of the king, took everything, the gold shields that Solomon had made. And King Rehoboam made shields of bronze in their place and committed them to the care of the commanders. He had the gold shields stolen and he replaced them with bronze shields. Guys, can you imagine trying to replace your wife's gold wedding band with a bronze band? Wouldn't work very well. And you know what happens to bronze? It turns green, it tarnishes, it doesn't retain its beauty. In fact, if you want bronze to retain any beauty at all and splendor, it takes a lot of human effort, it takes a lot of muscle in order to keep it shining. And the lesson is this: our worship of God is to be pure. It is to be from a pure heart. Jesus said we must worship in spirit and in truth. That is, that we must worship in the appropriate way to bring honor and glory to Christ, doing things that give glory to Him. But sometimes it seems that the church has exchanged pure worship for a worship that is a cheap imitation. We often think that the brilliance of our worship can be maintained by the works of the flesh, or by the labors of our hands, or by the sweat of our brow. But David reminds us in Psalm 51 and verse 17 that the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So we must make worship that which is true from our hearts. We must make sure that our hearts are right before the Lord as we worship Him. Otherwise, we rob God of His glory, the glory of which He is worthy. That whole story of Rehoboam exchanging the gold shields for bronze, it's just an unimaginable turn of events in which he would forsake the beauty of God for the beauty of the world. Well, there are a few things to remember as we finish up here in 1 Kings Solomon was the third and the last king over all the tribes of Israel. Obviously, you had Saul, you had David, and then Solomon. And after Solomon's death came the broken kingdom, the divided kingdom. The ark, we read in chapter 8 and verse 9, the ark of the covenant contained only the 2 tablets of stone on which were written the 10 commandments. That was the only thing that was in the ark of the covenant when it was moved to the temple. The Sodomites practiced their abominations under Rehoboam's rule, according to chapter 14. Elijah was the first person to raise someone from the dead in chapter 17. And Ahab, King Ahab, wicked King Ahab, died in battle, but he died by a random arrow that had been shot into the air. So that was quite an untimely and unworthy end to King Ahab. Well, again, our key verse is 1 Kings 3:9, so you'll need to work on memorizing that so that you can fill in the blanks when we have our next test. Well, that's the look at 1 Kings, and I hope it's an encouragement to you as we continue our study in the Word of God. Until next time, grace and peace.